A Wager on the Future. Anarchist Organization, the Islamic State, the Crisis, and Outer Space. By Josep Gardeneyes. The Successes and Shortcomings of Anarchism. At a moment when anarchism is growing worldwide, we also find, curiously, a waxing feeling of cynicism, loss, or existential crisis, experienced individually as much as collectively, which is stronger, it seems to us, than the cycle of generational burnout typical of the last decades. Many anarchist tactics of destruction and confrontation, for example, ways of rioting and attacking with covered faces, have been adopted by many people outside of anarchist circles, and in places such as Egypt, Greece, the US, Brazil, or Spain, we know that the passing on of tactics has been in part direct. The silence in which society tried to bury anarchism for decades has been definitively broken. In countries from Greece to Chile to the US, anarchism has become a political force, capable of influencing social discourses and unmasking at least some of the discursive defenses that democratic states use to achieve their goals. And here in the Spanish state, we have seen the phenomenon of hashtag Yo también soy anarquista, or hashtag I am also an anarchist, by which some masses have positioned themselves on the side of anarchists who have not only been repressed but also labeled by the state as terrorists. Meanwhile, the positive ideas and practices of anarchism have not kept pace. And it is not due to a lack of familiarity. On the contrary, in many social movements that created important experiences and conflicts, practices of decision-making in assemblies, consensus, and a rejection of political parties and representatives have been momentarily generalized, only to be abandoned. Self-organization spreads more and more, but distancing itself from a revolutionary horizon, championing instead financial feasibility, productivity, alternative currencies, and other capitalist tools, disguising this blind path with a false sophistication, as we can observe in the most dogmatic sector of the Cooperativa Integral Catalana, which, to be clear, also includes many important and radical projects. Ever more comrades in ever more countries have lived through surprising conflicts in which all the sacred lies were questioned, new complicities and broad relations of solidarity were opened up, and the forces of order lost control. But, afterwards, everything went on as before, perhaps with a change in the configuration or the disguises of power. It is true that struggles, as with everything in nature, are cyclical, and we must learn to abide this cyclicity. In that vein, the comrades from CrimeThink have made a compilation of texts about what to do after the crest, recently translated to Spanish. But the current loss of morale goes much further. We believe we are on the brink of losing our chance of intervening in the conflicts underway and frustrating the attempts of capitalism to adapt itself to the new crises that flash out worldwide and trans-thematically, crisscrossing the arenas of the ecological, economic, ideological, political, technological, and cultural. With urgency, we must analyze the shortcomings of an anarchism on the rise in the last years. Why is there so little complicity with anarchism's positive practices? We cannot blame a lack of dissemination, although more propaganda always comes in handy. The mechanisms of anarchist propaganda have improved greatly in the last decade. And, outside our own activity, as concerns the reactions of official society to our presence, many academics and celebrities have mentioned and even adhered to anarchist ideas. Today, radical books can become bestsellers, as The Coming Insurrection proves. I don't mention this to celebrate it, but to prove that in many countries at least, anyone who wants to get to know anarchist ideas can. The Islamic State. Neither can we blame media distortion for spreading an erroneous idea of anarchism. The press fabricate their defamations and their police narratives constantly, and they have to be countered, but it would be victimistic to hand them responsibility for our isolation. We can make use of a comparison to put the problem in perspective. In the media, no one gets worse coverage than the Islamic fundamentalists. They are portrayed as the most extreme terrorists and monsters. Nonetheless, a large percentage of marginalized youth in Europe sympathizes or even directly supports jihadist movements. Of course, they tend to be immigrants from Muslim countries, but many of them were born here and were not convinced by democratic Europe. There is also an important margin of converts. In fact, it is a very significant phenomenon for our age that the most attractive anti-system movement is jihadism, or, more precisely, attractive for some and totally repulsive and horrifying for others. How do jihadists recruit? Largely through Twitter and chat rooms, media that anarchists have been using for years without achieving similar results. If a comparison between the propaganda of the Islamic State and that of anarchism comes off as absurd or morbid, if it recalls the pseudo-intellectual operations of right-wing journalists and academics trying to connect different species of subversives, it is because its purpose is satirical. Today, the system comprised by the police and media once again oblige anarchists to play the part of terrorists, at least in some countries. But it is a casting that ridicules the very director, because in the spectacle of terrorism, we anarchists can't keep up with the competition. We are not on par with the jihadists. It's as though Chuck Norris, after defeating an alien invasion of 3-meter insects armed with lasers and chainsaws, has to beat a delinquent pizza delivery boy. It doesn't make a good sequel. The specter of anarchist terrorism also ridicules those comrades who put great emphasis on the practice of attentados, or attentats, attacks that function as propaganda by the deed. In an age when the state is ever more capable of absorbing and taking advantage of the shocks caused by attentados much more devastating than our own, and those comrades who imagine themselves as the unbreakable enemy of the state, in an age when the war is ever more unilateral. Perhaps our attacks need to take on a new symbolic meaning and a new relation with social conflicts. They are not the most important blows in the dramatic war, but a sort of anti-machine that we introduce into the breaches opened by social conflicts, so that they generalize and sabotage the materialization of the relations of power. There is a footnote. In fact, it is necessary to underscore the fact that since the Second World War, wars no longer consist of battles between armies, but of the production of meta-machines that mobilize destructive and organizational forces. Their field is none other than statistics. To those readers who take this for empty verberia, I recommend an analysis of the methodological contributions of Robert McNamara, previously of the Ford Motor Company, to the Office of Statistical Control and the U.S. Defense Department, or of the management by M16 of the intellectual property production of the mathematics of Project Ultra. End footnote. However, the satire is above all directed at those populist comrades who try to reproduce the propaganda successes of any entity, no matter how distant it is from anarchism, such as left-wing parties or marketing companies. They would never dare to copy the recruitment formula of the Islamic State, not for any critique of the incompatibility of anarchist and authoritarian methods, which would also bar their copying of marketing techniques and the recruitment organized by political parties, but out of an acritical impulse to flee from the things that generate bad press, the same way that they flee from those anarchist practices that are also stigmatized by the media. The success of the Islamic State disproves any attempt to blame the failures of anarchism on defamation, ignorance, or bad press. If there were anything attractive about anarchism, it would shine out despite the defamatory campaigns of the press. We will not find our shortcomings in the arena of dissemination and propaganda. Anarchist ideas are not hidden. Rather, they are not being looked for. They are not distorted, except insofar as no one cares to clarify them. If they are not triumphing, it is because they are not useful. If the failure of anarchism has resulted in the rise of new left-wing parties, as we will see further on, it can be said that the failure of the insurrections of the banlieue, the poor suburbs of France where major riots broke out in 2005, similar to subsequent riots in the UK, has contributed to jihadism. In both cases, large sectors of society failed in their attempts to self-organize their struggles, and subsequently they searched for the power to achieve changes they were seeking. Power itself is the key element. A movement without social power, like anarchism, that, what's more, seeks to dissolve or decentralize power, cannot copy the formula of a movement that does exercise power. A fish has a better chance of learning locomotion from a duck. Power always attracts more followers than a beautiful idea, and thanks to the geopolitical situation in the Middle East and the extremely myopic policies of the world's superpower, the United States, for some years now in an irreversible decline, the jihadists have been able to seize a significant quantity of power and to appear as the most dedicated and fierce opposition to the symbols and presumed leaders of the current world system. And here we find the true importance of the figure of jihadist terrorism. Since 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union, the capitalist world system has lacked an oppositional dichotomy that can modulate and recuperate all dissident movements. Liberal capitalism was the most effective in the developed countries, and also on the global scale, whereas state capitalism, the USSR, China, Cuba, etc., was at least as effective in underdeveloped countries where revolutionary movements might potentially abolish the economic system. Capitalism in such countries needed the state to play a stronger role in its development, and also to institutionalize or neutralize the dissident forces that might interrupt it. For decades, all the social movements in the world had to subordinate themselves to one of these two paradigms, daring at the most to constitute a loyal opposition. Since 1921, with the imminent Bolshevik victory in the Russian Civil War and the defeat of revolutionary movements in Italy and Germany, thanks to the bureaucracy of communist and socialist parties as well as that of anarcho-syndicalist unions, which inaugurated a statist realpolitik among the leadership of the USSR, who for decades dedicated themselves to suffocating any revolutionary movement that they could not control or that did not respond to their geopolitical interests. The revolutionary horizon had been blotted out. Any rebellious movement was conditioned to accept the precepts and the sponsorship of one of the two dominant poles, and the, quote, freedom of the first pole and the anti-capitalism of the second were both lies. From then on, the anarchists were completely marginalized. The naive leftists, allied with one of the two poles, denounced their supposed lack of pragmatism, while the right accused them of being communist agents. Anarchism had definitively lost its protagonism. These dynamics were only accentuated by the Spanish Civil War, that brief blooming of hope in the last country where the proletariat still had not received the memo that the revolution had already been defeated. In 1991, for the first time in 70 years, there was no global dichotomy capable of modulating revolt. The bad guys disappeared, and with them disappeared any hope that the winners had of resembling good guys. The misery of the system only grew, and now there was no one else to blame. The first autonomous lines of struggle to appear emerged from indigenous movements, at Oca as in Chiapas. These had also been subordinated to the politics of the left, with disastrous consequences, as much for the victims of the socialist genocides as for those who opted for democratic patience. Soon, the anti-globalization movement appeared, and within it the anarchists gained more and more protagonism and influence. The other pole in a new global antagonism had begun to define itself on its own. The interior tension was drawn between those who had many resources and little legitimacy, and who proposed the legality of some dominant institutions against others, and those who projected a revolutionary horizon and a path based on horizontality and self-organization. In 2001, with the jihadist attentates against the economic and political capitals of New York and Washington, D.C., the world system adopted a new paradigm based once again in an oppositional dichotomy between democracy and terrorism. Like every paradigm, it did not appear from thin air. Its laboratories were countries such as Spain or Germany that already had integral anti-terrorism policies, more advanced than the anemic attempts of Reagan or Clinton to install anti-terrorism. But, starting in 2001, it was developed as a conjunction of moral narrative, political discourses, institutional mandates, interstate connections, and juridico-military resources that of any government allied with the global powers could make use of. Footnote: it is interesting to underscore how the United States and its allies have enabled the rise of jihadism, though an extensive analysis falls outside the scope of this text. It is enough to signal how the injustices that feed jihadism, for example dictatorships in Saudi Arabia, Palestine, Egypt, and Indonesia, are funded by the world powers. The fields on which jihadism evolved and trained, in Afghanistan and Bosnia, were created and supplied by the Western states. The secular, left-wing Palestinian resistance was replaced by a fundamentalist resistance less able to win international support, thanks to the policies of the Israeli state, and in some cases thanks to direct interventions by the Israeli secret services, and also thanks to the ineptitude and corruption of Palestinian left itself. Jihadism in Iraq appeared out of thin air and became the principal force opposed to the occupation, thanks to a Pentagon campaign to give them more protagonism in the media. There are also difficult to substantiate accusations that the secret services of Great Britain and the U.S. organized interreligious attentates between Shia and Sunni that were blamed on jihadists, breaking the solidarity between sectors of the resistance and increasing fundamentalism. End footnote. It is vital to recognize that we are again on the brink of losing any possibility for protagonism or influence within global conflicts. Therefore, we must analyze the differences between the old and the new pole of the bad guys. On the one hand, terrorism is much more bad, more evil than its predecessor. Only people of a very determinate identity could be seduced by jihadism, quite different from all the ignorant followers and acritical bootlickers that the USSR or Cuba won among the left worldwide. The liberal bloc's necessary pretensions of freedom and equality during the Cold War often limited the repressive capacities of Western states with regards to their internal dissidents. They had to labor tirelessly to appear more than just communist states, given their great inequalities. The same dynamics no longer prevail. Today's states have to do very little to differentiate themselves from the apparent barbarians of jihadism. It is again a clash of civilizations, but if the bad guys appear so extremely uncivilized, the good guys can get away with a greater degree of barbarity, above all if it is packaged in the appropriate gloss of uniforms, impersonal technologies, and orderly and disciplined military deployments, like those we've seen this autumn in Paris and other European capitals. At the same time, the figure of jihadism is much less inclusive than that of communism. It is incredible for the right to accuse the typical anarchist of being an agent of fundamentalist Islam, or for the left accuse them of being unpragmatic for not supporting it, like they accused us for not supporting state communism. Worldwide, the majority of marginalized people are culturally distant enough from Islam that they are unlikely to ever identify with Islamic fundamentalism, though there are a billion people whom organizations like the Islamic State are seeking to represent and influence as co-religionists. The new dichotomy has another weakness. Quite the opposite of the ruling dichotomy during the Cold War, the current one has been constructed in an era when the principal world powers enjoy very little legitimacy and trust. The bloated, greedy, and arrogant figure of the United States in 2001 is a far cry from the heroic protector of liberty from the first two world wars. And the Europe of 2015, the Europe of austerity, of corruption, of bloody borders, doesn't look much better. In other words, we live in a world where the powerful are trying to hide and crush revolts, the desire for freedom, and revolutionary movements behind a curtain of anti-terrorism. Anti-terrorism is still convincing, it still mobilizes people and serves to justify more repression and control. But at the same time, this is a world in crisis, in which the majority of perturbed people, angry people, precarious people, are reluctant to trust either of the two poles of power. It is a dichotomy made to be taken apart, to allow us to again create a self-defined space of struggle and freedom. Yet, it seems that few anarchists have taken notice that attacking anti-terrorism, discursively and in practice, will not only decommission one of the most potent weapons in the state arsenal, it might also be our only chance of regaining our protagonism, self-defining a subjectivity of negation and rebellion, and projecting revolutionary paths in the coming years. Fighting against the oppositional dichotomy of terrorism from an anarchist position might bring us into contact with unexpected allies, as the upsurge in solidarity with the Kurdish liberation movement foreshadows, because the true opponents and victims of the Islamic State fundamentalists throughout the global south will either have to ally with the West or develop their own anarchistic visions. In fact, the Islamic State has a great deal in common with Syriza and Podemos. The most shocking differences are merely function on the level of violence that has been normalized in the societies where each was born, and the relative legitimacy that such violence grants to discourses and practices of revenge. The writings of Osama bin Laden demonstrate that al-Qaeda was largely an attempt to open space for an Islamic capitalism. This goal immediately suggests a predisposition to co-opt and lead the broader anti-colonial movements in which the organization arose. In fact, al-Qaeda's original geopolitical need to fight against both the USSR and the USA foreshadowed the subsequent historical situation in which anti-colonial movements, still dazed from their failed successes in the 60s and 70s, when they lost by winning, would no longer be able to appeal for help and protection to one of two dominant world powers. Their decentralized, stateless organization was a necessary adaptation to a more difficult security situation. In order to exercise a vanguardist relationship vis-a-vis the directionless anti-colonial movements, which even then were gearing up towards their anti-globalization phase, al-Qaeda had to spread an ideology enabling orthodoxical purity, Islamic fundamentalism playing the same role as Marxism before it, and to use spectacular tactics to capture the world's attention, similar to how groups like the RAF and the Red Brigades asserted hegemony over broad movements. On both of these fronts, Islamic State has surpassed them, coalescing a decentralized network into an actual state structure. Whereas al-Qaeda simply overshadowed other elements of the resistance movement in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere, IS has the possibility to actually monopolize the resistance, killing off any elements that oppose both fundamentalism and the West. Incidentally, the fact that IS has centralized a decentralized network, and given the West what its conventional military logic long craved, an enemy state, suggests the involvement of Western secret services in its creation. However, contrary to the conspiracy nuts, we would have to assert that it does not make much difference, because, in either case, what anarchists oppose, the statist logic, would be equally present. Likewise, Syriza and Podemos arose amidst decentralized but temporary directionalist movements, over which they quickly established hegemony, turning them into state-building forces. The fact that they spread misery with the instrument of law rather than bombs and knives is an aesthetic difference more significant to political scientists than to people interested in emancipating themselves. The crisis. Capitalism is in a profound crisis. It is not the first time, and it won't be the last. But it is the first time in which its crisis of accumulation overlaps with a planetary crisis, the unfolding failure of the ecosystems that sustain life on this planet. And it is also the first time that a crisis of accumulation occurs in a world with nuclear weapons, in which it is unclear which will be the next political power to organize the world system, and in which the power that is past its zenith still has the military might to liquidate any competitor that seeks to replace it. Little by little, the United States loses its hegemony, incapable of imposing its will in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in South America, in Eastern Europe. Nonetheless, it maintains the force to ensure that no other authority can impose a new hegemony. If they don't reach an accord to share power in a new world system, half a dozen countries have the ability to blow up the entire planet to make sure that no one gets any of the pie. The industrial expansion led by the United States after World War II reached its conclusion in the 70s, and since then the financial expansion has generated so much surplus value that there is nowhere to put it. Most economic activity has migrated to countries like China, South Korea, Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia, Turkey, and Brazil. But the structures and institutions of economic management belong to North America and Western Europe. And several of these structures were hit hard by the bankruptcies and scandals related to the 2008 crisis. The supposed world leaders can no longer offer a safe home for capital. A recession and collapse of the magnitude of 1929 has only been avoided, for the moment, by the massive immigration of capital to the real estate markets, the fittest for speculating and absorbing great quantities of capital, of China, Turkey, and Brazil. The bubble is about to burst. Outer space. What could prevent it from bursting? If the pattern in force in the global economy since the 15th century continues, only a new industrial expansion. Where could such an expansion take place, and with what materials? It is not clear. Is there a new process of industrialization able to absorb the greatest quantity of liquid capital in history and turn it into profits? The runaway production of smartphones and similar gadgets doesn't come close, and these products are already reaching the poorest corners of the world. And what new territories can be developed? Africa seems to be the only continent that could still host an intense process of capitalist development, but it's not big enough, neither in population nor in territory, to absorb the unimaginable quantity of liquid capital that is currently seeking investment, nor do we imagine that being invested in Africa would allow it to produce immediate profits. It must be understood that with each expansion, the quantity of capital in play grows exponentially. In contrast, the world population is not growing as fast, and the planet isn't growing at all. In fact, the energetic and biological capacity of the planet to sustain the economic processes of its most ungrateful species is decreasing. Logically, the only country not conquered by capitalism, the only terrain able to host the next expansion of capitalism, is outer space. We say it with complete sincerity. It must take the path of asteroid mining and the terraforming of Mars. Capitalism runs into a problem here, and it might be the only hope that we have to turn the present crisis into a blow that topples the world system, rather than serving as an impetus for another restructuring. For the first time in history, it may be that the crisis of accumulation has arrived before the technologies necessary for the next economic expansion. A few years still remain before a profitable colonization of outer space can be feasible. Imagination. But here we see where the state has put us in check. Over the course of several decades, it has killed the popular capacity for imagination. 100 years ago, revolutionary imaginaries were alive. We insist that such imaginaries are indispensable for a revolution, that no insurrection can grow and overcome its internal obstacles without widely shared revolutionary imaginaries, and without a popular imagination capable of adapting imaginaries in a decentralized way according to the needs of the struggle. The revolutionary imaginaries died, drowned in blood on the battlefields of the First World War, a morbid drama that demonstrated the fatal weakness of the proletarian class, and suffocated by Bolshevik cynicisms after their Russian counter-revolution, another fetid affair that demonstrated that the institutions of power are stronger and more determined than class, and that proletarians can easily be educated to serve as oppressors. Ultimately, imagination, the capacity to generate new imaginaries, has atrophied to the brink of death thanks to the techniques of the spectacle, the entertainment industry first modeled in Hollywood, and more recently in the new technological devices, the computers, video games, and game apps that so few revolutionaries have pointed out as being among our fiercest enemies. With the death of imagination, who could resist when capitalism offers us new worlds? The moment it achieves its self-interested dream, revealing it to be another step forward for exploitation, perhaps many revolutionaries will regret their foolish, lazy, acritical, populist, and cowardly postures in favor of technology. But it will be too late. Collapse or technosocialism. If capitalism does not manage to resuscitate itself and ignite an industrial expansion before the speculative bubble pops, we will be faced with a poverty much deeper than the one we already know. Are we prepared to resist emigration and hunger, the breakup of our fragile communities by an extreme misery? Or are we not even thinking of it? Are we not betting on a violent and catastrophic rupture with the capitalist system that currently feeds us? Were we imagining that we could keep on eating from the supermarkets? That there would be a smooth transition between a system of money and businesses and a total self-organization? That after a general strike or similar event, we would take down some barricades, fix a few damages, and continue living as before, only without laws or bosses? There is another possibility, a controlled collapse into a technosocialism worse than the most horrifying work of science fiction. The destruction of infrastructure and value has always been an important activity for capitalism. The devastation produced by a war or the deterioration which constitutes the first stage of gentrification are key to facilitating the posterior economic growth. In this sense, new technologies being developed by Google and Apple present a chance of clearing the way for a currently stagnant capitalism. The Internet of Things could merely be an unprecedented augmentation on the level of technological control, the achievement, finally, of the panopticon society. But it could also evolve into a sort of technosocialism, which is to say, an extreme rationalization of economic processes, ultimately superseding the short-term interests of the bourgeoisie, of the earlier epoch of capitalism, and of the multinationals, of the current epoch, which might be coming to its end. To understand this more clearly, we can take the example of the new smart cars. Understood within the prevailing logic, this would just be another product, an automated electric car that drives itself, a more expensive car model, more fetishized, available for wealthier consumers, another invention that would give the patent-owning company an ephemeral advantage in the market. But if the approach, especially by Google, that seeks a transformative rationalization via new technologies is realized, and at the moment the only obstacle is the uncertainty as to whether states will support or impede this transformation because the technology already exists, we will find ourselves faced with another possibility. The smart car, to take this one example, would not be another product bought by individuals in accordance with the logic of private property until now in force. New technologies would permit smart cars to function as alienated collective property deployed in the most efficient manner possible. As an example, we have the very primitive Be-Seeing model in Barcelona, subscription-based collective bicycle services distributed throughout the city, like the Provo's Yellow Bike program without the anti-capitalist element. Via an app, you would reserve a voyage and the smart car would come to pick you up. You'd pay a subscription as the car would not belong to you, but would be a facet of the city itself. So what would be the consequences of such a techno-economic organization? Beyond the disappearance of the taxi companies, it would mean the end, or at least a critical reduction in, the most important capitalist enterprises of the post-war period, the automobile makers and the oil companies. It would permit a significant degrowth as a path for capitalist expansion. For the first time, the systemic destruction that forms a part of cyclical capitalist expansion would not be the semi-uncontrolled result of a process of war or deterioration. Rather, it would arise from a rational restructuration par excellence. Alienated collective property and the algorithms that manage it would permit the most efficient utilization and deployment of the totality of vehicles so that they would always be in use or recharging. This would allow a great reduction in the total number of vehicles and in the transport infrastructure. Put another way, we are faced with a model of capitalist expansion, the production of new technologies, the total transformation of cities, that is completely compatible with precarity. Any consumer can be transported without having to own a vehicle. Every person can get by with less consumption, and with the ecological crisis. What's more, the same concept of alienated collective property, with hyper-rational management, can be put into effect in matters of housing, education, and other fundamental pillars that bind exploited people to the economy. Just as Jason Radegas and Lev Zlody, 2011, predicted, socialism was not made possible in accordance with the evolution of productive forces, but in accordance with the forces of social control. Collective property has always been feasible, but only now can alienated collective property be a reality. Property deployed according to a collective logic, shared property, but which is designed and controlled by the power structures. Fascism. Until now, we have insisted that anti-fascism is, and has been since the 1920s, a leftist strategy to control movements and obstruct truly anti-capitalist struggles. It has also always been a failure as far as fighting against fascism is concerned. Specifically, anarchist strategies for combating fascism have been more effective because they understand fascism as a tool of the bourgeoisie, equal in this sense to democracy, and thus they directly attacked fascism, not at the point where it enters into conflict with democracy, rights, civil liberties, moderation, but at the point where it converges with the interests of owners and governors. Since the end of World War II, anti-fascism has based itself on exaggeration, panic, and error, as a more sober analysis of the phenomenon of neo-fascism in countries like Russia, Greece, or Spain will show. Fascism has been reduced to a puppet and a minoritarian weapon within the democratic arsenal. But if an even stronger crisis arrives, if the democratic methodology for the management of capital is broken and delegitimized, will fascism come back? We don't rule out the possibility, but we predict this will only happen in a few less cosmopolitan countries, where the leaders and technocrats of a global perspective do not have specific strategic interests, and where they also do not understand the cultural particularities, like Hungary or Bulgaria. In general, we see two possibilities: the survival of democracy, in which neo-fascism is tolerated as a minoritarian tool, like in Germany, or suppressed/warned if it dares exceed its very limited mandate, as in Greece or Russia, and in which non-fascist dictatorships are tolerated on the periphery, always with the hope that they will one day become stable democracies. Or the emergence of a new political economic structuration of power. We make this prediction because fascism is the result of a very specific class relation, in which a national bourgeoisie unites with elements of the middle class, with organizers of unions or social movements, and with institutions like the press and the military. But today, national bourgeoisies do not exist as powerful and independent actors. The totalitarianism of the current world system is a technocracy, a totalitarianism of the material, incorporated into the social architecture and the technological organization of life. In sum, it is completely compatible with democracy, and has no need of charismas or conscious, agreed-upon alliances between classes, with their necessary protagonists and proactive actors. Of course, this would only change with the emergence of a model for a world system not only superior but also promoted by an authority capable of defeating and replacing the authority and architect of the current world system, or with the collapse of the current system and the absence of any hegemonic alternative. Of classes and technocrats. In any case, collapse is just a possibility, while crisis and austerity are already here. We must counteract them, and for this we have to criticize the neoliberalism that currently predominates in the thinking of technocrats and state leaders. But this task cannot be completed the easy way, portraying neoliberalism and austerity as the greatest evil, when they are just another facet of capitalism. Because if capitalism resolves this crisis, preventing an economic collapse, prosperity will return and we will have lost. Populist comrades take note. All the strength and influence gained through opportunistic discourses that sought superficial affinities and sympathies by speaking of the evils of the crisis, the evils of austerity. We must not forget how alone we were in the era of economic growth, when we were practically the only ones who protested against capitalism. The doggedness of global capitalism in the face of a possible collapse demonstrate that the current structures of economic management, IMF, central banks, Federal Reserve, private banks protected by state treasuries, are much stronger than those of prior eras. And the ability of the Chinese state, a possible successor as world leader, to avoid or at least stave off the popping of the financial bubble on its home turf and the plummeting of its stock market has saved, up until now, the global economy, which, left in the hands of the Wall Street-Washington axis, would have already failed. This reflects the greater technocratic capacity of a more centralized state to direct the accumulation of capital and manage its excesses. Footnote. The events of the past few years also demonstrates the poverty of negreist and anti-imperialist analyses. There is no conflict between the state and multinationals' capital. Only the same conflict as always between dominant states and their institutions, banks, and businesses, and the less powerful states that are subordinated to a global system that does not privilege their interests. The latter, the victims within an anti-imperialist framework, have their own institutions, banks, and businesses, and they have proven perfectly capable of developing autochthonous capitalisms every time they have achieved the autonomy necessary to do it. Of course, the absolute dependence of the major banks on state bailouts shows that it is a question of distinct structures in a unified system, and not antagonists in conflict, nor a boss and a mere tool. End footnote. A single-party system is clearly less able to obstruct and recuperate popular revolt, but perhaps this is no longer the chief concern of our rulers. If the Chinese model triumphs in the coming years, we already have an image of the organization of power in the future. If, on the other hand, democracy is not surpassed, fascism will also remain, because fascism is the intrinsic antagonist, which is to say a little brother, a complement, of democracy. A strong democracy smothers fascism, a weak democracy uses it as a subordinate tool, and a failed democracy with no politico-economic structure to surpass it. All of which should suggest, at least to the astute readers, an important change in the structuration of capitalism in class society. Class society has changed. It is a fact. A class of bourgeois investors united by class interests, which are interpreted subjectively by each individual, and divided by competition and distinct national affinities, functions differently from a system of networks of technocratic institutions and businesses in which individual actions are modulated by an impersonalized institutional functioning, and in which a huge part of the flows of capital are automated, managed by algorithms. This difference is evident at every level. The relations between states, or has it escaped anyone's attention that there have been no wars between major states like those that defined earlier centuries since 1945? The diminished importance of individual capitalists? The proportion of fixed and liquid capital controlled by inhuman/institutional entities? The way large corporations function more as public/private institutions than as businesses directed by a capitalist? The increase in the power of institutions and bureaucracies vis-à-vis rich individuals or charismatic politicians, the decline in the importance of the figure of the bourgeois owner or investor, the greater flexibility and the disappearance of fixed lines between workers, bosses, managers of capital, and labor discipline, the astronomical rise in the importance of managers, directors, specialists, and other species of technocrats, and a long etc. Unfortunately, a detailed analysis of these changes, outside the circle of specialists and academics lacking revolutionary perspectives or conflictive experience in the streets, has not been common. Footnote. Neither do I think we're inventing the wheel here. There are several examples of lucid analyses of the aforementioned changes, standing out among them the Terra Cremata, Art, or GEA La Correa, but almost always on a microscale, normally with the city as the frame of analysis. For a global analysis, one would have to refer to the followers of communization theory who, diminishing slightly their lucidity, fall into a fetishization of the economic sphere as the only lens of analysis and into a lack of revolutionary projectuality, giving an almost exclusive protagonism to capital. End footnote. Some even dogmatically attack the attempts to perceive and understand these changes, be it the almost religious attachment to the figure of the proletariat as evidenced by the comrades of Proletarios Internacionalistas, or the laughable combination of ignorance and arrogance present in texts like Cuando se señala la luna. The result of this lack of investigation are comrades who propose that the crisis is just a show and a conspiracy, and many more who have not thought of the possible exits from the crisis that the powerful dispose of. To express it all more clearly, although also simply, austerity, which began shortly after the crises of the 70s, which signaled the end of the industrial expansion and the beginning of the financial expansion, reflects the vital need of capitalism to open more spheres of life and society to the investment of the excessively abundant liquid capital that it has generated. Privatization is one way to open more infrastructures and institutions to investment. Austerity does not avoid crisis, because the accumulation of capital is infinite and the successful investment of surplus only generates more surplus that must be invested or lost. Rather, it prolongs it. But the managers of capital are incapable of doing anything else, just as people dying of hunger will kill a chicken instead of waiting for it to lay eggs. Ending austerity and once again giving priority to social funding, the powerful might be able to stop the advance of a popular revolt. But at the moment, and with good reason, they fear an economic collapse, which is inevitable as long as some currently unknown frontier for economic expansion is opened up, much more than a popular revolt, which is merely a possibility and a distant one it seems. Even if they began to fear a revolt, they cannot stop looking for new terrain for the investment of their capital, so they will continue to pressure for austerity. And only an economically self-sufficient state, and not even Germany, which has avoided augmenting its budget with loans, as the US does, meets this criterion, would be capable of resisting the pressure, or a state politically powerful enough to break with the dominant ethics and default on loans to important lenders. The promises of the left. Against this panorama, the new parties of the left have promised that which they are incapable of delivering, ending austerity without destroying capitalism. As we have already seen, austerity can only end through a new capitalist expansion or through a social revolution that finally topples the incorrigible internal dynamics of capitalism. And, as we have seen so many times in history, the state is not able to destroy capitalism, as long as an even more exploitative economic system doesn't come along, because the state is an apparatus of alienation and domination that is obliged to supply and fund itself via the most effectively exploitative economic structures available. If you impose your will with a gun, the only thing you can never do is close the bullet factory. A self-sufficient people does not generate the alienable surplus that a state needs to finance itself and impose its decisions. We anarchists are perfectly positioned to indicate the incoherence, the unrealism, and the falseness of the left, but we are lost in a great confusion. In part, it is ideological. The refusal of many anarchists to develop profound and sensible critiques of democracy and technology turns them into cheerleaders of the principal axes of social control the state disposes of at this decisive juncture. They appeal to those two fundamental values of the current system of domination, out of fear, laziness, opportunism, and a lack of any scrupulous analysis. It is much easier to, quote, communicate with the masses by denouncing the politicians of the moment rather than questioning the pillars of society itself. Today, anyone who criticizes democracy or technology exposes themselves to the worst marginalization and persecution. In the dismal simulation of a strategy, these populists surrender to the demands of the system itself and make apologies for the values of their supposed enemy has taught them must never be questioned. But more than ideological, the confusion is emotional. After the waves of repression, after witnessing so many times how every success we achieve fades away for reasons we don't fully appreciate, we get tired. Without imagination, we have no revolutionary horizon. Without a renewed global analysis, we don't understand what is happening in the world around us. And without enthusiasm, we cannot generate the conflictive projectuality that would enable us to learn in the course of action. We stagnate, we stop. We waste our energies in initiatives destined to failure.